Okay, thank you. So this is a discussion of justice and normative justification. And the main idea is that we're going to appeal to moral reasoning as the basis of justification for principles of justice. So our inquiry here in the course has to do with social justice. The idea of justice does not pertain to the whole of morality. That is, justice doesn't apply to many questions of personal morality or personal ethics, our personal relationships with each other, our special obligations that we have to others, what the conception of a good life is, etc. But justice does pertain to the organization and functioning of social institutions, political, economic, and educational. And it applies, therefore, to the system of social institutions that comprise what John Rawls called the basic structure of society. So any society is organized around a set of social institutions, and justice pertains to the organization and the functioning of those social institutions. As John Rawls wrote on page 1 of his famous book, A Theory of Justice, he begins his inquiry into justice by saying justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected or revised if it is untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. End quote. So justice pertains to the virtue or the goodness, and in particular the justice, the fairness of social institutions. That is, justice refers to the terms, the rules or principles of social cooperation. So we liken society, we conceive of society as a system of social cooperation, which is governed and regulated by a system, by a set of terms or rules. And the question of justice pertains to terms or principles of social cooperation should we adopt to regulate the basic institutions of society. And those basic institutions include schools and the educational system as a whole. There is a fundamental need for justification of these principles or terms of social cooperation. Social cooperation is grounded in trust or mutual assurance. It's a necessary condition for the order and stability of society. And trust is the basic condition for trust in an effective state or an effective government. Citizens require some kind of assurance that the laws will be enforced fairly, and that is the role of the state or the government. This idea of having a powerful and effective state goes back it goes back to Plato and his Republic, but in its modern formation, it goes back to Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century British political philosopher, who argued that citizens would agree to contract with each other to empower a authoritarian state to keep the citizens in line to maintain security and social order. The problem with the state, any state government, is that it tends toward despotism. That is, the coercive power of the state needs to be checked. It can, left to its own devices, the governmental political power will become tyrannical, left to itself, because power is corrupting, and those who hold power will try to hold on to it and increase their power. One of the answers to checking state power, familiar to us as Americans, is the establishment of a constitutional architecture of checks and balances, which achieves a balance or a division of power. And the U.S. Constitution, developed by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others, the founders, the framers of the Constitution, they put in place a architecture designed to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of a minority or a few people. And they did this by developing a legal system that divided power, and that enumerated the division of the distribution of power. However, however effective that constitutional architecture is in preventing concentrations of power, it is insufficient, as we saw in the last few years of our political lives. If that system is to possess moral and political legitimacy, the citizenry must freely endorse the founding principles of the government and its laws and policies in light of those principles. So, in order to have a free society, a free and just society, the people must participate, and they must endorse the principles of justice that regulate the government, and as well as other important basic institutions. However, in order for the people to endorse and to affirm the principle of justice as the regulating rules of institutions and the terms of social cooperation, they must understand those principles as being morally justifiable. And therefore, valid justification of the principles of justice which govern the society, that valid justification is the source of the political legitimacy of those principles and the political legitimacy of political power in the society. For most of the history of justice in the West, at least, there has been the assumption that the social order was fixed by nature and that considerations of justice were confined within a fixed hierarchical social terrain. The basic assumption throughout the history of justice has been that people were fundamentally unequal in their standing in the society, and that created the existence of a hierarchical society with a few elite on the top and the rest of the population on the bottom. However, this is rejected with the idea of democracy and with a democratic conception of justice, which assumes that the basic structure of society are not fixed by nature, that some people are not superior to others by nature, but that the basic structure of society is open to human choice and therefore a human assessment. That is, we are capable of exercising constitutional choice. this is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, going back to the founding, to Thomas Jefferson's comment or powerful statement in the Declaration that there was a right of the people to alter or abolish the government and to institute new forms of government, and to change, to invoke and instantiate more just principles for the organization of society. And Alexander Hamilton expresses the same in the Federalist Papers, whether and citing on the side that human beings were capable of establishing government from choice, from reflection and choice, rather than depending upon accident and force. So from this perspective, the structure of the society, the basic structure of society, in particular its governmental system, is an object of choice rather than determined by some form of nature or natural law. And therefore we can assess and scrutinize the principles of justice upon which our society is founded. This brings us to the idea of the justification of principles of justice. So the basic idea here is that, and this relates back to the discovery of an unwritten constitution, or the assertion that there exists an unwritten constitution along with a formal written constitution. There is a set of principles, of norms, of values that underlie the Constitution, and that therefore underlie and regulate the rules of institutions and the terms of social cooperation. However, and so we, the claim here is that the basic institutions of society run on the basis of rules, of norms, of principles, principles of justice. However, these principles of justice must be validated. In quoting Kurt Baer, it's not enough to show that if certain criteria or rules are employed, then a thing must have to have a certain degree of goodness or justice. We must also show that these criteria ought to be employed. So we need to consider, not only to consider what principles of justice and political values we should adopt, but we also have to consider the standards of validity upon which we can assess their justifiability. So we can and should ask whether the principles of justice and the judgments that follow from those principles are morally justifiable and just and thus legitimate. So we could do an empirical study of what principles of justice exist in a society, and that is of value. But from a normative point of view, we would have to ask, are the existing principles of justice that regulate the society, are they justifiable in themselves? And that leads us to the question of what is the rational basis of their validity, of the validity of our values, our principles, and our judgments. On what basis can we assess the justifiability of the principles of justice that regulate our society, or any society? And that's a fundamental philosophical and political question. And that's at the heart of our inquiry here today, is spelling out a framework of justification. What is the rational basis of the justification of our principles. And throughout the course, we will be exploring a number of substantive principles of justice and applying them to substantive educational issues, policy issues. And my proposal is that we, because we're focusing on these substantive principles and applying them to educational policy, we can step back and ask, are the principles of justice justifiable themselves? Is there a way to justify the validity of those principles? And to get at that notion of justification, I turn to Charles Sanders Peirce's 4 methods of settling beliefs. Peirce was a noted, become more noted over time. Peirce, along with John Dewey and William James, was the founder of the American Philosophical School of Pragmatism. And Peirce suggested that there are 4 methods for settling beliefs, and he had in mind empirical beliefs, methods of determining the political validity of certain claims about the world. However, I think that his methods of settling beliefs, especially the method of what he calls science, can be adapted to the question of the normative justification of principles of justice. So let's turn to those 4 methods. The first method is the method of tenacity, and that is an attempt to hold on to one's belief by avoiding competing reasons that would challenge it. It's an attempt to close off, to justify one's own belief by closing it off from competing claims and ideas. It's similar to the common parent saying, the child asking, the parent saying to the child, do what X, Y, and Z, and the child asks, well, why do I have to do X, Y, and Z? And the parent replies, because I said so. That's the method of tenacity. The problem with tenacity is that it claims to be right on grounds that the mere belief in the validity of one's own principle itself is sufficient justification for its validity. In other words, tenacity argues, because I believe it, it is valid. And of course, this method is solipsistic and it is relativistic. It claims that my belief is valid solely because I believe it. However, normative claims, claims of justice, claims of injustice, claims of right and wrong are always addressed to others. And in particular, as we've discussed, the principles of justice pertain to social cooperation and the basic structure of society. So claims of justice and injustice are addressed to others, and therefore we have to include others in deliberation about the validity of our principles, the claim that our principles are right. And justice is what we are due and what we owe others. It pertains to our relationships with others, and therefore leaving others out of consideration undermines tenacity as a method of settling beliefs, settling what should count as just. So that's one method that fails, the method of tenacity. A second method following Peirce is the method of social acceptance. And from this perspective, it is argued that the existence of certain values and principles that are widely shared and accepted is sufficient justification for their validity. In other words, if they are widely shared in the society, then they are justifiable on the grounds that they are widely shared and affirmed. Of course, social acceptance has an important role to play. It's a necessary condition for justification, but it's not sufficient. Given our need for belonging, we can and often do construct the social order in terms of our group membership, and thus social acceptance of our principles is a necessary condition for their validity. Therefore, social acceptance is of significant importance, but it's insufficient as a method of justification of our principles. So even if something is believed and valued by a social group, the mere acceptance of those beliefs or values are not sufficient to justify them. For even if widely shared and affirmed, we know historically that social values and principles can be biased, they can be exclusionary, they can be culturally violent and unjust. Clear examples of slavery, racial segregation, patriarchal gender discrimination, all were purported to be justified by appeal to widely shared values and conventions. So the mere fact of social acceptance of principles is not sufficient normatively to justify their validity. Principles require justification on moral grounds that regulate what should be socially acceptable. So true normative justification and the authentic justification of principles of justice appeal to the idea of what should be acceptable or their justified acceptability rather than merely being accepted. So the method of social acceptance is insufficient to provide justification, a rational basis for the justification of moral principles. We have to have something that goes beyond mere social acceptance for justification to be authentic. That brings us to the third method, which is a method of authority. And this method is an appeal to moral truth as reasons of justification. And this has been identified as rational intuitionism in the philosophical literature, among other names. It can lead to fundamentalism, to the claim of absolute certainty of a particular claim, principle, or value. And this view, from a moral point of view, asserts that there is a independent universal moral truth and moral order that can be comprehended by human cognition. And that when we can comprehend this moral truth, that the truth of the moral order, that provides us with reasons of justification for our following principles and values. Moral truth from this perspective provides us with reasons of justification. And this goes back to Plato's Republic, Plato in the Republic argued that those who are in possession of authentic moral knowledge, that is moral truth, should govern the society. So Plato argued that philosopher, kings and queens, those men and women who could comprehend the truth, the moral truth, should have political power. And everyone else should defer to them because they have the truth. They are in a possession of the truth. And Plato argued, as others have, that only a few people are capable of comprehending the truth. We find these ideas in various religious, we find this in various religious ethics of an appeal to a universal moral truth. So one method, one possible rational basis of justification of principles of justice is to appeal to the moral truth. However, there are at least two problems with authority as the method of justification. One is that the claim of certainty based upon rational intuitionism is untenable. It does not offer an independent method of justification of the validity of the cognition or the rational intuition of the moral truth. The question of on what legitimate basis certain moral knowledge is validated actually remains unanswered. Often, especially from a religious point of view, it is claimed that moral truth is found in the religious scriptures and doctrines of the religion, and appeal to those scriptures is the way that the truth of the principles are validated. But that begs the question of their legitimate basis. One could ask, from a religious point of view, for example, one could claim that it is right because God commands it. But we could ask, well, does God command it because it is right? Does the right precede the claim of and on what basis is the claim to be validated? And this leads to the second problem with authority and moral truth, is that it leaves open the question of who validates that the moral elite, the philosophers, have attained the moral truth, and that question is also left unanswered. And it's left unanswered by Plato as well. It seems that he will be the arbitrator in the Republic, that Plato himself would be the arbiter of who qualifies as a philosopher and who qualifies as a knower of the moral truth. There are also further issues that cast doubt upon the method of authority. There is the problem of induction, suggesting that claims of certainty regarding the moral truth are misplaced. The problem of induction is the problem that there's no way to verify with certainty the truth of a proposition that relies on empirical evidence. Also, there are what John Rawls called the burdens of judgment, that our human reason is fallible, and claims of certain truth because of our reason is fallible are always suspect. The claim of absolute truth suggests that we are free of error and free of distortion, free of being mistaken, and that seems to go beyond the capability of human reason. Furthermore, our reason, the exercise of our thinking processes, of our rational processes, are also influenced by a variety of emotional, by emotion, and also by our tendency to engage in to be biased in certain ways, to often engage in confirmation bias, to cherry pick our evidence, and to disregard conflicting evidence. We are also prone to conformity bias, that is, We do not, we tend to conform with the ideas of the social group that we are members of in order to maintain our position in that social group. We tend to conform to the prevailing opinions and beliefs of that group, and that also protects our identity. So we have identity protective bias as well. We'll explore these various forms of bias when we talk about who belongs and whose truth in the next few weeks. Um, and there's also the historical tendency of imposing beliefs onto others. A common feature of fundamentalism is to impose by force or by power the beliefs, one's beliefs onto others. So there are significant problems with the validity of the method of authority. The method of authority has significant problematic aspects to it. And that leads us to the Peirce's fourth method of the method of science. The method of science proceeds on the assumption that verifiable certainty, that knowledge is not dependent upon verifiable certainty. That one, even in the face of uncertainty, one can come to a provisional degree of confirmation and therefore some provisional verification of the validity of one's claims. And this leads us to the method of science, so-called, and subsequently to an appeal to moral reasoning as a method of normative justification. So even if we can't claim that we can know something with certainty, we can know things empirically, and we can justify normatively certain principles to a provisional degree of justification rather than absolute justification. And this leads us to the task of an appeal to moral reasoning as the fundamental method of normative justification. So the task of knowledge inquiry is not to achieve certainty, but to search for and find error. And this is from the perspective of the method of science. That inquiry is about seeking disconfirmation of the truth of one's propositions, which are based upon established methods and standards of inquiry. That is the rational basis following Karl Popper. The rational basis of inquiry is the testing of hypotheses in order to determine whether they survive attempts to falsify them. That is, scientific knowledge proceeds on the basis of falsification rather than the discovery of truth per se. And that those propositions or hypotheses that do survive critical scrutiny are those that we take to be validated knowledge. But it's always provisional because we can, new data, new insight can emerge that would invalidate what we thought to be true or what we knew to be true. And this suggests that knowledge is grounded in intersubjective agreement generated from a process of critical reasoning. That is, the key to establishing beliefs is to subject them to processes, public critical scrutiny, and disconfirmation. And this suggests that no one is above error and that no individual can claim authority. That is the process of knowledge. The establishment of knowledge is a social process that is intersubjective and based upon intersubjective warrantability rather than claims of absolute truth. And we can apply this idea of science as disconfirmation, of science as public critical scrutiny to normative justification. It applies to normative inquiry. And the approach that follows is an appeal to a method of moral reasoning as a way of justifying the validity of our principles of justice. That normative justification can be arrived at through reasoning and not by appeal to an independent moral order, to a social tradition, or to authority. So from this perspective, the justification of principles of justice and the judgments based upon them are grounded in a particular process of moral reasoning. And this is a process, I believe, that runs parallel but is distinct from the process of empirical reasoning. Normative reasoning, or the method of moral reasoning, employs different methods and different standards of validity than does the process of empirical science. But there's a parallel between them in that both employ public processes of disconfirmation and scrutiny. So from this perspective, justification is a function of reason. And this leads us to the question of what constitutes the rational basis of justification in moral reasoning. That is, what are the criteria or standards can we appeal to in justifying normative propositions, such as principles of justice? What are the criteria upon which we can determine the validity of our principles of justice? A point of departure is that moral reasoning is addressed toward others. And what is disclosed by it being addressed to others is that moral reasoning is grounded in the moral point of view defined by fairness, by the elements of fairness. And these elements can serve as basic moral reasons for the justification of our principles and our judgments based upon those principles. And from this perspective, the hallmark of moral reasoning is that its validity is grounded in intersubjective mutual understanding and agreement under fair conditions. And this is, in a more formal sense, this is what is referred to as moral constructivism in the literature. And moral constructivism is a process of justification through a procedure of deliberation that is defined in terms of fairness, such that the fair conditions of agreement between the parties in that deliberation represent what citizens would adopt in a situation that is fair between them. So the moral legitimacy of the results of deliberation culminating in an agreement are transferred in this process from the normative validity of fairness to the outcome. So if the conditions under which we agree to certain principles are fair, then that agreement becomes normatively valid because it is grounded in fairness. So moral constructivism employs the elements of fairness as standards of acceptable restrictions or restraints on the reasons that parties may apply to justify the validity of their principles. So the validity of their principles are judged, evaluated, assessed from within the perspective of fairness. So a principle of justice is justifiable and legitimate if it can be shown and understood to comport with the elements of fairness. That is, they should be consistent with the elements of fairness upon due reflection. So we're not appealing to principles of justice that are based in moral truth and or even custom. We are proposing to test the normative validity of our principles by appeal to reasons of fairness. And the reasons of fairness or elements of fairness, there are at least 4 elements of fairness that we can appeal to justify our principles: equality, recognition, reciprocity, and impartiality. These elements are the presuppositions of fairness in a way that they are the rules of, analogously to the rules of a game, that the primary rules of the game that define the game and form the basis of secondary rules. And these presuppositions or elements of fairness are interconnected and interdependent with each other. They relate to and depend upon each other, forming a multidimensional concept of fairness. So fairness involves equality, the presupposition that each person should be considered as possessing an equal inherent value. And fairness requires, in other words, that persons have equal standing and equal consideration of their interests. Therefore, a valid moral principle or principle of justice must give equal weight to the interests of all affected. Immanuel Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative articulates this idea of equality, that each person is an end in themselves and should never be treated merely as a means to someone else's end. This is the principle of humanity as an end in itself, and it requires respect for persons. So equality is a fundamental element of fairness. A second element of fairness is the idea of recognition. And this also goes back to the ancient Greeks, who identified what they called thymos, which is a psychologigal demand for recognition and for respect for one's dignity. Isothymia expresses a desire to be recognized as an equal. And the claim is that each person has a fundamental desire, a very basic desire, to be recognized as an equal. George Hegel, in the 19th century, famous German philosopher, picked up on this idea of recognition, or isothymia, and defined the ethical life, our moral relations between persons, based upon recognition. That the idea of recognition made possible, that the ethical life, that moral relations between persons were made possible by the reciprocal recognition of each person's equal dignity. That is, in order to be an equal, to have equal standing, our equality must be recognized by others. And in fact, Hegel argued that the realization of one's own inherent value is contingent upon being recognized by others as equal. So from the perspective of recognition, equality is intersubjective. It is based upon mutual reciprocal recognition. And this leads to a moral imperative similar to Kant's categorical imperative from Hegel, that his imperative was be a person and respect others as persons. And This is also, recognition is also captured by Martin Buber's conception of the I-thou relationship, an encounter and meeting between equal subjects. At the same time that we have a desire for recognition and that equality is intersubjective based in mutual reciprocal recognition, at the same time we have another tendency as well, a psychological tendency to want to be recognized not as equals, but as recognized for our own unique contributions or accomplishments, that we also want to be recognized as being a superior in some way, or at least meritorious, that makes us distinct from others in terms of our value. And this is what the Greeks called megaothymia. And that for Hegel led to the master-slave relationship, was a relationship of domination. That also there's a tendency in the human psyche to want to dominate others, to be superior to them. And that can be achieved in fair and just ways, but often it leads to injustice, violence and injustice. But from the perspective of fairness, recognition, I believe, is a fundamental element of fairness. That any principle of justice requires that each person be recognized as an equal. The third element of fairness is reciprocity, and reciprocity suggests a reciprocity of mutual agreement, which requires that whatever our principles are that define our moral and political relationship between citizens must be acceptable to all affected. The terms must be such that no reasonable person would have grounds to reject them. This is the idea of reciprocity. And it requires that we arrange our political life on terms that others cannot reasonably reject, quoting John Rawls. And as the philosopher Thomas Scanlon suggested, thinking about right and wrong is at the basic level thinking about what could be justified to others on grounds that they, if appropriately motivated, could not reasonably reject. So reciprocity requires mutual agreement between the parties to the principles, and stipulates that no person would reject them. And this reciprocity also includes the idea that we can't, it's invalid to claim for ourselves as right what we would deny others. So if we claim something, a right to something, and deny that right to others, then we are in violation of reciprocity. That the principle or the claim must be mutually reciprocal in order to be valid. And finally, the fourth element of fairness is impartiality. This is interconnected with reciprocity, that the general acceptance of a principle of justice cannot appeal to bias or pure self-interest. That in our deliberation, we cannot validate any principle of justice just because it serves our self-interest. And this is a principle may be expressed as if a principle is in my rational self-interest, then it is right to pursue it regardless how it affects others. And this is similar to the maxim of indifference. I may not do anything in order to help others when they are in need or to assist them in distress unless at the time it is rational for me to do so in view of my own interests. We can reject these principles on the grounds that they are self-serving, and that any principle of justice or any judgment based upon a principle of justice must be impartial in the sense that it must go beyond serving our own narrow self-interests. So the idea of both impartiality and reciprocity can be and has been expressed by the philosopher Rainer Forst, German philosopher, who invokes or articulated a principle of reciprocal justification. The idea of reciprocity is that one cannot raise any specific claims while rejecting like claims of others, and that impartiality also entails the idea of reciprocity of reasons, that one can't simply assume that others share one's reasons. The terms of the agreement must be impartial in the sense that to project the specific meaning of one's terms onto others is to bias the agreement in one's favor. So we have four elements of fairness, and we're suggesting that we can reason morally in terms of fairness, that we can deliberate about the coherence between these criteria of fairness and our principles of justice, and that the principles that best cohere with fairness are the ones that have the best justifying reasons. A valid principle of justice is one, we could argue, that is coherent or consistent with fairness. And also, we can apply the idea of fairness as well, not just to the validity of principles of justice, but we can also apply them to the validity of shared values. And we can ask, does the social value cohere with fairness upon due reflection? So this is an appeal to moral reasoning in terms of fairness, and it's intended to test the justifiability of our principles of justice. And if our principles turn out to be justifiable, then we can ground the justification of laws and policies upon those principles. And this idea of moral reasoning therefore extends to public deliberation between citizens regarding their political judgments and their claims pertaining to laws and policies. And from this perspective, we have a civic duty to each other, what Rawls referred to as a duty of civility, to explain and justify our political preferences and opinions, our recommendations. We have an obligation to offer justification of them in terms of principles of justice that are valid in terms of their consistency with fairness. The duty of civility is an appeal to valid principles of justice during public deliberation. And therefore this is a public process, a process of public reasoning and justification addressed to others, and that gives its special validity to appealing to moral reasoning as the basis of justification. So in the end, moral reasoning concerns the question of justifiability of our principles of justice and our shared social values in terms of a test of fairness. And these fair terms, these principles, constitute the fair terms of social cooperation, and they're the foundation of our basic institutional structure, including educational institutions. It's therefore to say that a norm or an institution is unjust or just, it's to make a claim, and that claim should be backed by valid reasons and not merely personal preferences. And this process of moral reasoning and judgment is one of deliberating and offering reasons that justify our claims. So that's the basic idea, that we can appeal to a framework of moral reasoning to justify various, or to critique various principles of justice, their justifiability and legitimacy through this process of moral reasoning from within the moral point of view of fairness. Any questions? I know that was very long.